A world shaken. The end of the Great War. The echoes of artillery fire and the cries of soldiers had finally ceased. The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918. The armistice brought an end to the hostilities and a fragile peace began to take shape. The armistice signed that day marked the end of the First World War, a conflict that had engulfed the globe for 4 long years. Leaders from the warring nations gathered to put pen to paper, hoping to forge a new path forward. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the cost of victory was staggering. Cities lay in ruins and the landscape of Europe was forever changed. Millions lay dead, empires were in ruins, and the political and social landscape of the world had been irrevocably altered. The war had left deep scars that would take generations to heal. The war had been a brutal affair, characterized by trench warfare, poison gas, and unprecedented casualties. Soldiers endured unimaginable hardships, living in squalid conditions and facing constant danger. It had pitted the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, against the Allied powers led by France, Britain, Russia, and eventually the United States. The alliances and enmities formed during this period would shape global politics for decades to come. The conflict had its roots in a complex web of alliances, nationalism, and imperial rivalries. These tensions had been simmering for years, waiting for a spark to ignite them. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo in June 1914 provided the spark that ignited the tinderbox of Europe. This single event set off a chain reaction that would engulf the world in war. Austria-Hungary, blaming Serbia for the assassination, declared war, triggering a chain reaction of alliances that drew the great powers into the conflict. What might have been a regional skirmish quickly spiraled out of control. What began as a localized dispute in the Balkans rapidly escalated into a global war. Nations far and wide were drawn into the fray, each bringing their own grievances and ambitions to the battlefield. The conflict spread beyond the trenches of Europe to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia as colonial powers drew upon their empires for manpower and resources. Soldiers from distant lands found themselves fighting in foreign fields far from home. The world watched in horror as the conflict dragged on, year after year, claiming millions of lives. The scale of the devastation was unprecedented, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of humanity. Empires crumble, nations rise, the New World Order. The war's end brought about a dramatic reshaping of the political map. The once mighty empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans lay in ruins, shattered by internal divisions and military defeat. From their ashes emerged new nations, each grappling with the challenges of independence and self-determination. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of nationalities held together by the Habsburg dynasty, dissolved into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, weakened by years of decline and defeat, was dismantled, with its territories divided among the victorious Allied powers. The war also had profound consequences for the victorious nations. Britain and France, though victorious, emerged from the conflict exhausted and deeply in debt. The war had taken a heavy toll on their economies and manpower, leaving them weakened and vulnerable. Russia, racked by revolution and civil war, withdrew from the conflict in 1917. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power, promising peace, land and bread to the war-weary Russian people. The Russian Revolution sent shockwaves throughout the world, raising fears of communist uprisings in other countries. The Treaty of Versailles, a flawed peace? This question has been debated by historians and scholars for decades. In January 1919, representatives from the victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris to negotiate a peace treaty with Germany. This conference, known as the Paris Peace Conference, was a monumental event, bringing together leaders from around the world to shape the future of Europe and beyond. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was intended to ensure a lasting peace and prevent another global conflict. The treaty was seen as a means to bring stability and order to a war-torn continent. However, the treaty proved to be deeply flawed and sowed the seeds of future conflict. Critics argue that the terms were too harsh and punitive, creating a sense of injustice and humiliation. The treaty blamed Germany for the war and imposed harsh penalties on the defeated nation. This blame was encapsulated in the infamous war guilt clause which placed full responsibility for the conflict on Germany's shoulders. Germany was forced to cede territory, disarm its military and pay massive reparations to the Allies. These reparations were intended to compensate the Allies for the immense costs of the war, but they placed a tremendous burden on the German economy. The treaty also included a war guilt clause, forcing Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. This clause was particularly controversial and was seen as a national humiliation by many Germans. The Treaty of Versailles was met with outrage in Germany, where it was seen as a dictated peace imposed by vengeful victors. The German public and political leaders alike condemned the treaty, viewing it as unjust and oppressive. The treaty's harsh terms, particularly the reparations payments, crippled the German economy and fueled resentment toward the Allies. The economic hardship led to hyperinflation and widespread poverty, further destabilizing the nation. Many historians argue that the Treaty of Versailles, rather than creating a lasting peace, created a climate of bitterness and resentment that contributed to the rise of extremism and the outbreak of World War II. The treaty's failure to foster genuine reconciliation and its punitive measures are often cited as key factors in the resurgence of conflict. The treaty's failure to address the underlying causes of the war, such as nationalism and imperial rivalry, meant that the potential for future conflict remained. These unresolved issues continued to simmer beneath the surface, eventually erupting into another devastating global conflict just 2 decades later. Section 4. Economic upheaval from boom to bust. The First World War had a profound impact on the global economy. The conflict shattered trade networks, drained national treasuries and left millions unemployed. The immediate post-war years were marked by economic instability, inflation and social unrest as nations struggled to rebuild their shattered economies. The United States, which had entered the war late and emerged relatively unscathed, experienced an economic boom in the 1920s. However, this prosperity proved to be short-lived. The Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered a global economic depression, plunging the world into the Great Depression. The Great Depression had devastating consequences around the world. Unemployment soared, businesses failed, and millions were plunged into poverty. The economic crisis fueled social and political instability, contributing to the rise of extremist movements in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Section 5. Social scars. A generation transformed. The First World War had a profound impact on the social fabric of nations around the world. The conflict shattered traditional social hierarchies, challenged gender roles, and left a generation scarred by the horrors of war. The war had claimed the lives of millions of young men, leaving a generation of widows and orphans to cope with their loss. The war's impact on gender roles was significant as women took on jobs traditionally held by men. Women's contributions to the war effort challenged traditional gender roles and paved the way for greater social and political rights in the post-war era. The war also had a profound psychological impact on those who had experienced its horrors firsthand. The lost generation of writers and artists, disillusioned by the war, sought to make sense of their experiences through their work. Their art and literature reflected the trauma, disillusionment, and loss of innocence that characterized the post-war era. Section 6. The League of Nations, a Hope for Peace, a Legacy of Failure. In the aftermath of the war, there was a widespread desire to prevent a repeat of the horrors that had just unfolded. The devastation was fresh in the minds of millions, and the world was desperate for a solution that would ensure lasting peace and stability. The League of Nations was created in 1920 with the goal of preventing future wars through international cooperation and collective security. It was a bold and ambitious endeavor born out of the ashes of a world that had seen unprecedented destruction and loss. The League, the brainchild of US President Woodrow Wilson, was envisioned as a forum where nations could peacefully resolve their disputes. Wilson's vision was one of diplomacy and dialogue, where the power of words would replace the power of weapons. However, the League of Nations proved to be ineffective in preventing the outbreak of another world war. Despite its noble intentions, the League struggled to assert its authority and influence in a world still rife with nationalistic fervor and political tensions. The League lacked its own military force and relied on its member states to enforce its decisions. This reliance on the goodwill and cooperation of its members was a significant weakness, as it left the League powerless in the face of defiance. This weakness was exposed in the 1930s when the League failed to prevent Japan's invasion of Manchuria, Italy's conquest of Ethiopia, and other acts of aggression that challenged its authority, and Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland. These events highlighted the League's inability to enforce its own resolutions and maintain peace. The League's failure to take decisive action against these acts of aggression emboldened aggressor nations and contributed to the outbreak of World War II. The world watched as the League's promises of peace crumbled under the weight of unchecked ambition and militarism. The League's legacy is a mixed one. While it ultimately failed to prevent another global conflict, it did represent an important step toward international cooperation and laid the groundwork for future efforts. The creation of the United Nations after World War II was a direct result of the lessons learned from the League's shortcomings. The UN was designed to be a stronger, more effective organization, with mechanisms in place to address the very issues that had plagued its predecessor. In this way, the League of Nations, despite its failures, played a crucial role in shaping the future of global diplomacy and peacekeeping.